Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I recently shared with you all the 46 books that I had read from the 100 best books of the 21st century as determined by 300 plus people on the part of the New York Times. And I was reminded during the course of that discussion of how much I loved Lucia Berlin. I went back and took a very, very close look at this guy, at A Manual for Cleaning Women. And I went back and looked at the lecture that I wrote on it back when we were having these talks in the bookstore. Turns out I did a 3-hour-long talk in 2 different sections. We are not, in fact, going to talk about Lucia Berlin today for 3 hours, but I can tell you that even when I spoke about her for 3 hours, we were barely scratching the surface. One of the things I'm going to try to do now is to give a talk on every single one of the books that I gave a 10 to. Absolutely, most certainly, I gave Lucia Berlin's A Manual for Cleaning Women a 10. Her writing is just absolutely incredible. It is surprising, it's unique, it has so much breadth. There is so much going on. In every single story, there's like some major, major thing that is happening. There's lots of plot. There's just an incredible panoply of characters that are so incredibly well drawn. But the most important thing for me is the language. It is economical, it is surprising, there's humor, there's all sorts of depth. I mean, it's just unlike anyone else you have ever read. If you have never read Lucia Berlin, then today I am hoping not only to convince you that you should, but also to sort of flag all of the things that you might look for and that you might be especially appreciating in her work. If you have read Lucia Berlin, then today I will be hopefully deepening your appreciation of her and also treating you to just some bits and pieces of the writing. When you pull out some of these sentences and paragraphs, it is just an absolute masterclass in every type of literary prowess. But it's also just such a joy. It is such a joy to read all of her work. It is such a joy to hear it. So I'm really pleased about today's talk. For those of you who like an agenda, here is what we are doing today. We're going to talk a bit more about why I think the writing is so absolutely magical. We're then going to talk just a very brief outline of the astonishing biography of Lucia Berlin. This is someone who has really lived just an absolutely crazy, just bonkers kind of life, and it really does inform almost every aspect of her writing. We're then going to talk about how Lucia Berlin fits into this notion of autofiction. We're going to talk then briefly about the cohesion of the work and how this is obviously a short story collection, but how in many ways it reads in such a satisfying way because it's this kind of kaleidoscopic vision of a self that is relatively coherent, actually. There's a nice sort of cohesion to the stories. It's almost like one of those novels made from interlocking stories. We're then going to take a very close look at A Manual for Cleaning Women, which is the title story. And as always, it's just such a joy and such a privilege to look closely at the prose to really just see how it is that she is pulling off this incredible literary feat. We're then going to look at humor. Her humor is just unbelievable. It is so, so good. And we're going to talk a little bit about how humor functions in general, and then take a look at this just masterclass of how literary humor works very, very best. And then, in order to close, we're going to look very briefly at the endings of a couple of her stories because the endings are just incredible. They do that perfect thing, which is where they are so surprising and sort of shocking, but also totally inevitable. And even as they are tying up a beautiful story and growing organically from it and concluding it in this beautiful way, they're also opening it up in many, many ways so that the reader is left with a sense of satisfaction, but also one of expansiveness that is it's just unbelievable and unlike any other writer I can think of. Well, I mean, that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but right at this moment, no one is coming to mind. If I have not already fully communicated my enthusiasm, I'll just read this very quick list here of some of the most compelling aspects that I think we see in her writing. One is this just absolutely astonishing prose. The other is just the intensity of the writing. Again, some very intense things are happening here. We are talking about being a mother. We are talking about being a daughter. We are talking about really devastating substance abuse disorder. We're talking about poverty. We are talking about really ambitious and sort of ill-fated love affairs. And throughout it all, there's this incredible truth. And I think this kind of truth, I mean, these are obviously fiction, and we're about to get into the idea of autofiction and her biography, but there's a sense of truth, and in fact, it grows from a sense of verisimilitude. Her details and the way that she paints characters and the way that she creates scenes make them seem so lifelike. And also, we know that a lot of this stuff is autobiographical, which, again, we're about to get to. But that sense of truth just makes them all the more devastating and all the more enlightening. And I think that there's a huge amount of compassion in these stories, both for the self and for the other. And I think that compassion, together with this boldness, just makes the writing unlike any other. We're going to dip quickly into her biography. Lucia Berlin was born in 1936. Her father, I believe at the time of her birth, was working in Alaska, some sort of governmental, he was running all of the mines and whatnot that were up in Alaska. She grew up both in Alaska and then in mining towns throughout the West. Her father would kind of move around and oversee these different mining towns. He went off to the Second World War, and at that point, Berlin went with her mother to live in Texas, and in fact, we see lots of those Texans throughout the story. Her mother, in many ways, was difficult, was an alcoholic, had a very, very colorful family, again, who feature very heavily in the work. After her father was out of the Second World War, the family moved to Chile. She spent her high school years in Santiago. And you have this sense of the contrasts, going from Alaska to the West and then down to South America. And in South America, they lived a very different life, the life of, wealthy expatriate government officials down there. So as an adult, she kind of continued this itinerant thing. She ends up having 4 children and lots of different romances. I don't know how many different husbands that she has, but the 4 children have some different fathers. As an adult, she lives in the Bay Area, she lives in Mexico City, she lives in New Mexico, she lives in Arizona, she lives in New York City. And you do see all of those places in the fiction. And this is part of the reason why the fiction feels so kind of true, is because so many of these details were taken from her life. In the excellent foreword to my edition, it's the one with the incredible key on the front and with the foreword by Lydia Davis. And Lydia Davis is very clear about the fact that Lucia Berlin is a practitioner of what is known as autofiction in France. In France, for a long, long time, there's a long tradition of writing that it's essentially sort of fictive memoir. We also see it with Karl Ove Knausgaard. We see it with Tove Jansson, who is Scandinavian. Those both are Scandinavian people. And then we see it a lot in France. Annie Ernaux is someone, Nathalie Sarraute. These are people who are a little less concerned about the idea of memoir as being strictly factual. So Lucia Berlin here in the United States, these are all known as fiction, but in fact they are based a lot in her biographical data. Lydia Davis says this: Lucia Berlin based many of her stories on events in her own life. One of her sons said, Lucia Berlin based many of her stories on events in her own life. One of her sons said, after her death, Ma wrote true stories, not necessarily autobiographical, but close enough for horseshoes. Then a little further down, our family stories and memories have been slowly reshaped, embellished, and edited to the extent that I'm not sure what really happened all the time. Lucia said this didn't matter. The story is the thing. So she admitted, in fact, to lots of exaggeration in what she was writing and lots of embellishment. But a lot of the times you can sort of map whatever is happening in the story to actual things that happened in her life. I myself am someone who doesn't really believe, especially in memoir about young childhood, that all of the details which make these things really come alive are in fact verifiable. And we all know that family stories are very molded by the way that they are told, and that in fact they often end up being very far from fact. So I'm suspicious of this idea of a memoir as being like super factual, and I'm also just not that interested in it. With someone like Lucia Berlin, I have a little frisson. It's like I'm very excited when I have this sense of these things as really being possible, because I know in fact that she worked as a cleaning woman in Oakland, and I know for a fact that she lived in Mexico City, and I know for a fact that she has 4 sons. So all of these things that map from her life, the facts of her life that map onto the short fiction, I really appreciate, and I like that idea. But I also don't particularly care about the idea of like proving that these things are true or not true. Lucia herself says, I exaggerate a lot and I get fiction and reality mixed up, but I don't actually ever lie. This sounds a little bit squishy, this kind of definition of things being true and exaggeration and embellishment and not lying. But I think there's also a sense, too, of emotional truth. And part of that truth grows out of verisimilitude. So verisimilitude is simply a reader's sense that the world created by the author feels real. And everything about Berlin feels real. So I love this idea, this tension between sort of what is true and what is not. I also think, in fact, if you were somehow able to say like a somewhat true story or lots of this is true on the front of the book instead of saying short stories, I do think they would sell better. Americans are very invested in this idea of what is true. And a lot of what happens in her life is so astonishing, in fact. There are so many outrageous events in this book that very much like Mary Carr or like Jeanette Winterson or whoever's that woman who wrote The Glass Castle. If we were able to say that this was a memoir, I do think it would sell better. And I can tell you right now that I actually never read The Glass Castle. And I love Mary Carr, but haven't read it for a long time. This is language, this is prose that just I find so much more rewarding than many memoirs. And frankly, I'm not particularly concerned about the question of fiction and nonfiction. I'm very happily reading these as short stories. Those of you who listened to my talk on the 64 books that I read also know that I was very happy that Lydia Davis was included. In fact, it was the collected stories of Lydia Davis that was included. Lydia Davis is famous for saying that her stories, a lot of them that are like one line long, are not in fact meant to be read back to back to back. They're meant to be read one at a time, sort of one in a sitting. And I think they function very well like that because they open themselves up to lots of thought, and they're stories that are deceivingly simple and yet that sort of multiply in meaning in your head. Lucia Berlin's work I find very different in that regard. I really like reading this whole thing almost, as I mentioned before, as kind of a novel in stories. So we see a rough chronology here. We have in the beginning a younger girl. We have we have an incredible story of a young protagonist who is with her grandfather in Texas, with both of the grandparents being alcoholic and the mother being sort of difficult to be with, which would have mapped very closely onto Lucia Berlin's own childhood. We have stories about being in a South American high school. We have stories about really doomed and really intense love affairs. We then move on to stories that have young sons in them. Then we move on, to more mature adulthood, and finally into stories of a much older woman, in fact, one who is facing her own mortality. So you have this kind of chronology through the work, through A Manual for Cleaning Women, that is so helpful and is so excellent because it does feel like you are watching someone evolve. The beautiful thing, though, is that right from the beginning, we have this incredibly wry, dry, hilarious, inventive, unique voice. So we're hearing, even when we're talking about, young childhood adventures, we are hearing it from the perspective of this incredibly wise, hilarious, kind of world-weary woman. The stories also feel kind of cohesive in that our protagonists, lots of times the names are changing. Sometimes it's Lou, sometimes it's Lucia, sometimes it's Carlota. There are all sorts of different names that this protagonist is given. And yet a lot of the sort of tone and a lot of the biographical features of this protagonist, it's mostly a woman. It is someone who, in fact, lives in the same places. We have a certain cohesion here in terms of the scope of a life, and that is also very satisfying. So I would argue, yes, absolutely, it's a short story collection, but in many ways it reads like a memoir, and in many ways it also reads like one of those delicious novels told in short stories. Before we dive into our close look at the title story, A Manual for Cleaning Women, I wanted to do this very cool thing, which is to look at the table of contents. I like it when a table of contents has, especially if it's a novel, in fact, if it has chapter titles that are very distinctive, not just like numbers or something, and that also tell you a lot about what is coming. So in this case, obviously, these are the titles of the stories, and in some ways, A Manual for Cleaning Women is sort of arbitrary. I really like it as a title, but I was thinking while I was walking my dogs earlier this morning, and that there are many different stories that we might be able to use, and I wanted to run quickly through the table of contents, partially also because it is so delightful to have your memory jogged just by the mere mention of some of these incredible works by Berlin. So as we move through, we can have like a little test where we see whether or not we think it would be a good title for the entire collection. The first one is called Angel's Laundromat, which, I mean, I think that's like actually not a bad contender. Angel's Laundromat is like, it actually sounds like Dennis Johnson, like Jesus' son and, Angel's Laundromat, that kind of thing. It's not like that. Actually, in some ways, her work is a little bit like Dennis Johnson. Interesting. The next story is called Dr. H.A. Moynihan. That maybe is not a great title for the collection, but boy, does that bring back, I mean, that is just an insane story about her grandfather and all sorts of dental mayhem that ensues. It's also a really difficult story in lots of ways. We're going to look at the very ending of it when we close. There's one called Stars and Saints, and if that weren't like so kind of on the nose, I think it might make an excellent title for the collection. Then A Manual for Cleaning Women, then My Jockey, which is a very short story and very telling in many ways and very charming, but probably not a great title for the book. Then we have El Tin, then we have Point of View, which would sound like a grammar handbook maybe. We then have Her First Detox, which again, this is speaking to that kind of chronology. Like we have many detoxes through the book and we have all of these struggles. I mean, that is on page 56. So even, only a sixth of the way through the book, who knows about that math? That was like a wild guess there. But relatively early, we have Her First Detox, which is also signaling us to the fact that this is not going to be an easy fight with alcohol. Phantom Pain, Tiger Bites, Emergency Room Notebook, 1977, Temps Perdu. So you might imagine that someone who is as skilled and as just incredibly good as Lucia Berlin, this is someone who reads very widely, also probably wildly. But she has this Temps Perdu is a reference, of course, to Proust. We have this À la recherche du temps perdu, which is in search of lost time. So Temps Perdu meaning lost time. At one point, she has this incredible description of this this person who comes to her house, and she gives this description about his rank alcoholic smell, and he's huge and he's fat and he's like huffing and puffing when he gets to the top of the stairs, and how she loves him right away. So you have this sense of compassion and of relating to people that is so deep and so impressive. But she also has this thing about how his smell essentially is like a Madeleine for her. So we have this echo not only of Proust as a writer, but also of this idea of searching for lost time, the idea of sort of resurrecting a past and a childhood and understanding things that maybe you couldn't understand as a child. So I really, really like the Proust parallel, and I like the fact that one of these stories is named so boldly after him. We then have Carpe Diem, which I can't even remember what that was now, that we read something recently here at the Fox page where they were talking about how Carpe Diem is not in fact seize the day, it's more like gently pluck the day, which I love that. I love that, probably because of whatever that Dead Poet Society movie is, I think. We all have that idea of Carpe Diem as like a very American, like get out there and seize the day, when in fact we're meant to sort of pluck the day gently. Then we move on to Toda Luna, Todo Año, probably not the best name. Then we move on to Good and Bad, which actually Good and Bad might be a great name for this collection. Melina, Friends, Unmanageable, Electric Car, El Paso. Oh my gosh, I turned the page, look, there are so many more. We are not going to read through all of these. I think actually we have a good sense already of the breadth. That is so funny. I only read like a third of them, which speaks to just the literal volume of the stories and the breadth of them. But my point stands, I think, which is that these titles are different and evocative and just as textural as the book itself. But, the title, A Manual for Cleaning Women, is somewhat arbitrary, and yet it is one that I really like very much. Also, let's just say straight up, Lucia Berlin is very good at titles for short stories. We're now going to dive into the actual short story, A Manual for Cleaning Women. A couple of things, sort of overarching things that I think make this such an outstanding story. One is there's a certain detachment. This is a manual. It purports to be kind of advice, sort of like a how-to. And in many ways, there is some advice, and some of it is very specific, and some of it I liked very much. But of course, it's speaking to a much wider breadth than just like a manual for actual cleaning women. There's an incredible amount of compassion. I mentioned that before, both for the self and the other. Berlin does this amazing thing too, where she cuts across race and class and education and all of these different sort of strata that we here in the United States are so hung up on. She cuts across all of those with an ease and with a naturalness that is really actually, talk about a manual, it's really an incredible primer, essentially, on how to have compassion for everyone and how to meet people where they are and understand that everyone is doing their best. We also here have this incredible economy. She is one of the most economical writers. There are times when the prose gets very sort of high-flown and really beautiful and ornate, but there are other times where she essentially is using things like onomatopoeia, using words that just sound like a sound in order to evoke an entire world. And we do see some of that kind of staccato, is the word Lydia Davis uses at the beginning, some of that kind of staccato prose where simple fragments stand in for hugely important concepts. I also love the kind of metaphorical idea of this. So she is a cleaning woman. This is someone who is cleaning someone else's messes. This is someone who is getting kind of down and dirty. The idea of cleaning something and sort of, this effort of things as being messy and wanting to establish order. In some ways, her writing is establishing a certain sort of order out of messiness, but it's not fighting the messiness. It's sort of sinking into the concept. We also have this idea of intimacy, the way that cleaning people really do end up knowing very well the people whose houses they are cleaning. Also a sense of voyeurism, and this idea of power dynamics and how interesting the power dynamics are. Of course, just one of the most important things about this is that it is very much a story about grief. It is the story about a woman who is a cleaning woman who is really grieving the loss of a lover. And the beautiful thing is that that is not kind of first and foremost. Most of all, you think it really does read like a manual, but feathered in this really beautiful, unique way are the very difficult ways that she is in fact missing this lover, Terry. We're going to dive in. So I'm going to read the very first thing. One of the things that she does throughout, there's this very cool structure where she names certain buses. So these are buses where, she is together with all of these other cleaning women and a lot of truths are spoken and a lot of sort of humanity is revealed. But I love this kind of sense of place. We get this really incredible vision of lots of places in Oakland. But I love the idea, too, that there's a certain structure given by the numbers of these buses and their routes that sort of act as like a scaffolding for the story. So this is the first paragraph. 42 Piedmont. Slow bus to Jack London Square. Maids and old ladies. I sat next to an old blind woman who was reading Braille, her finger gliding across the page, slow and quiet, line after line. It was soothing to watch, reading over her shoulder. So this is amazing. I mean, this emphasis on reading, but there's a bit of humor here too, this idea of reading over her shoulder and being soothed simply by this movement. It's this very beautiful sense too of making sense of things that you can't make sense of, but also accepting the things that in fact you cannot control. The beginning to this, again, this kind of notation form, slow bus to Jack London Square, maids and old ladies. Of course, Jack London is an incredible literary. He wrote like White Fang, and there's some other story that he's even more famous for. There's that story where the guy lights the fire and then all the snow falls down on him. Can't remember what that one's called. But Jack London, of course, being a Californian and being a hugely important literary figure, then moving on to the Braille, we have a certain primacy. Of course, in this case, it is Jack London Square. It's not Jack London himself. So you have this idea of things changing. You have this idea of impermanence, this idea of not knowing what your, sort of fate is going to be or your legacy. But again, this idea of this very soothing activity and also being in a space that is inhabited by women. I really love in this story the way that we see a lot of different women. It is the women that we tend to focus on here with this perspective of the cleaning woman. Okay, and then down a little bit further, cleaning women know everything. So there's this sense here that we are being addressed as readers by a cleaning woman, but there's this sense of wanting to reveal, wanting to sort of pull back the curtain in a way that is very appealing because there is this kind of direct address. Then right after that, we have this sentence, cleaning women do steal. Not the things the people we work for are so nervous about. It's the superfluity that finally gets to you. This idea of superfluity I can't even say that word right now. But this idea of superfluity speaks also to the registers that she has at her fingertips. So Lucia Berlin is someone who can have a sentence as declarative as, cleaning women do steal. It's just a very straightforward sentence. And then it is the superfluity that finally gets to you. So this idea of superfluity simply, as a word itself, but also like sort of the beauty of it and just the abundance that it speaks to. And a little further down, she's on the bus, and they're all comparing the things that they have stolen. I smoked while they compared booty, things they took, nail polish, perfume, toilet paper, things they were given, 1 earrings, 20 hangers, torn bras, which, speaks, in fact, to, the non-generosity of some of these employers. And then right under it, in parentheses, advice to cleaning women. Take everything that your lady gives you and say thank you. You can leave it on the bus in the crack. So I love the idea of this kind of parenthetical, like she's speaking to the larger population, but then she's giving like very specific advice only to cleaning women. And I love this idea of you can leave it on the bus in the crack, this idea of understanding that, at the end of a line of seats that there would be a certain crack. And the idea of not explaining that and it's sort of a shorthand that makes the reader, in fact, feel like they're somewhat in the know. The reader's like, yes, I've been on a bus before. There's an incredible intimacy to be had across all Lucia Berlin, in the sense that most of us have experienced a lot of what she is experiencing. And it's this beautiful thing where we haven't maybe experienced the crazy dental experience that she experiences with her grandfather, but we have, in fact, had that strange situation where we are sitting in one room and our grandparents are in the other, and that sort of gulf between the generations. So there is, at least that's something I have experienced. So in every story, you have this ability to relate to the narrator because there is something very relatable, like the crack in the bus, without any explanation and letting the reader understand that we're all in this together. But then the narrator goes on, in fact, to experience other things. And because we have established a certain amount of relatability, the reader can follow into these less familiar waters. Then we have a little bit of the humor, which we're going to look at in a minute. To get into the conversation, I showed them my bottle of sesame seeds. They roared with laughter. Oh, child, sesame seeds? We learned, of course, earlier that Mrs. Jessel, who is having some sort of dementia, has 15 bottles of sesame seeds. And we have this idea of this as being the superfluity. So there's, of course, a larger superfluity, but there's also just 15 jars of sesame seeds. And there's a sense, too, of our narrator as doing things in her own way, coming home with a bottle of sesame seeds. Then we have this kind of revealing sentence where the first person comes to the fore on the next page, on page 28. I'm not easily accepted by most old-time cleaning women. Hard to get cleaning jobs, too, because I'm educated. Sure as hell can't find any other jobs right now. Learned to tell ladies right away that my alcoholic husband just died, leaving me and the 4 kids. I had never worked before, raising the children and all. So this is one of these moments where we have this real sense of the narrator as telling us certain facts that in fact also do map very well onto the life of Lucia Berlin. And we have it in this kind of prose that is somewhat fragmentary. She doesn't say I again and again. She says things like, learn to tell the ladies right away. So we have this sense of that this is somewhat difficult for her to tell us this, and she's sort of getting it out all in one go. It also is something that she is telling the ladies, so we're not entirely sure if all of it is true. And it does, in fact, prepare us, though, very nicely, because we're sort of, at this point, our curiosity is piqued about what the circumstances of this woman are, this educated woman with 4 children who has never worked before and who is now a single mom. And then we have this beautiful slippage in down a little lower on that same page. I always get a transfer. Sometimes I give them away. Usually I just hold them. Tare used to tease me about how I was always holding things all the time. So Tare, this is T-E-R, it comes as a surprise. We don't know who this person is. So we have this intimacy of this nickname, and it's such a beautiful way to introduce this person because she says, Tare used to tease me all the time about how I was always holding things all the time. So this idea of always holding things all the time is so sad because, in fact, she is not able to hold Tare. Tare is someone who comes into her life and who leaves her life in a startling way, and she is, in fact, not able, to hold on to him. And then, in fact, right away we hear Tara's voice. Say, Maggie May, ain't nothing in this world you can hang on to, 'cept me, maybe. Which, again, is very sad. I also don't know here, this idea of Maggie May, of course, it's reminding me of that Rod Stewart song. And he is a younger person, this Tara person. So I think there is, I think we're meant to have an evocation in some ways of Rod Stewart, which is funny. And this is in the 70s, so we would have had, that makes some sense there. But also because this narrator is always changing names, we don't know if this is a nickname, we don't know if this is actually the name, but it's so appealing regardless. And I like the fact that there's still a bit of mystery. Then the next paragraph. One night on Telegraph, I woke up to feel him closing a Coors flip-top into my palm. He was smiling down at me. Terry was a young cowboy from Nebraska. He wouldn't go to foreign movies. I just realized it's because he couldn't read fast enough. This is incredible. So up earlier on the page, we have this idea of it's very difficult for her to get a job as a cleaning woman because she's educated. And then we find out that she's in love with this young cowboy from Nebraska named Terry. And then we have this absolutely stunning sentence where she says, I just realized it's because he couldn't read fast enough. Like she is having the revelation of something really important in real time in the fiction. This is why the fiction feels so revelatory and so immediate. It's just unbelievable. It's also really funny first of all, it's amazing that she has this compassion for him. And just despite any differences that they have, she's from Oakland, he's from Nebraska. They have this really very intense romance, and she is educated and he doesn't read very well. So you have this idea of very, very different people as being able to really deeply, deeply love each other in a way that is one of the really most appealing aspects of the collection. So throughout the story, again, we have these buses that are sort of the scaffolding, and we have this advice to cleaning women, which are these sort of framework ideas. And then, of course, we have what I would argue is the most important aspect of the story, which is the death of Terry. And then we have this other kind of shocking and very, it's not shocking at all. It's very subtle, but it's kind of ominous. We have this idea of our narrator as collecting pills as she is moving from house to house from all of these different people. And so you have this sense, there's a certain tension about whether or not she, in fact, is going to kill herself because she really cannot handle the fact that her lover is dead. So this kind of gathering of pills becomes a kind of another kind of structural element. On page 30, we have this. I have 30 pills now from Jessel, Burns, McIntyre, Horowitz, and Blum. And then right across the page, I still automatically say a Hail Mary silently whenever I hear a siren. This is a nuisance because I live on Pill Hill in Oakland next to 3 hospitals. So this kind of repetition of pill, it's also funny that she lives on Pill Hill in Oakland. I myself lived in Oakland for a couple of years. I loved living in Oakland. My sister is still there. So part of what's so charming to me is the way that she loves the Bay Area and that she loves Oakland. She talks at one point about being in a Denny's in Redwood City, and that is a Denny's that I went to all the time when I was in high school. So, there's a familiarity. And part of me is like, I feel like she's like my writer here from the Bay Area. But you would also feel like that if you were in Colorado or Mexico City or New Mexico or New York. So you have this idea, she's such a global citizen in some ways that I think so many people will be able to identify geographically. But so we have this kind of ominous thing where the pill idea, and literally just like the repetition of the word pill, should be somewhat ominous to you as a reader. Then we get on sort of 2 pages later, we have this. The Blums have a lot of pills, a plethora of pills. She has uppers, he has downers. Mr. Dr. Blum has belladonna pills. I don't know what they do, but I wish it was my name. This is one of these very subtle things. We're going to talk more about the humor, but she does these incredible sentences. She writes these incredible sentences where you're kind of moving along in a certain direction, and then she takes just a complete curve at the end here. So this idea too of they have a lot of pills, a plethora of pills. You have this idea that she's almost sort of playing real time with the language, almost like she's kind of drafting as she is going along. And then the idea of belladonna pills. So you have this repetition of pills, and then of course that she wishes her name were belladonna, which is just, it's absolutely amazing. And speaking of sort of taking a curve, we have this incredible description right across the page on page 33. She's describing Terry here. Terry refused to ride buses. The people depressed him sitting there. He liked Greyhound stations, though. We used to go to the ones in San Francisco and Oakland, mostly Oakland on San Pablo Avenue. Once he told me he loved me because I was like San Pablo Avenue. So already this is like a striking thing. San Pablo Avenue is colorful and interesting. It has gone through many, sort of waxing and waning in terms of its fortune, but it is diverse and busy and interesting. But what's really shocking is, so we have that sentence. Once he told me he loved me because I was like San Pablo Avenue. He was like the Berkeley dump. So this, you would imagine, is in fact, not a good thing to have someone be like a dump. But in fact, we know that she has this deep love for him and that she's really, really missing him. So we have to follow her along. And we trust at this point on page 33 of the collection, relatively early in the collection, that in fact, she's going to treat us to something surprising. And it certainly is surprising. So he was like the Berkeley dump. I wish there was a bus to the dump. We went there when we got homesick for New Mexico. It is stark and windy, and gulls soar like nighthawks in the desert. You can see the sky all around you and above you. Garbage trucks thunder through dust-billowing roads, gray dinosaurs. I mean, boy, does she deliver. In fact, when she says he was like the Berkeley dump, that in fact, that you're about to be treated to this completely new vision of something that is familiar to people. And even if you'd never been to a garbage dump before, she paints this incredibly beautiful picture, and in fact ends with this idea of gray dinosaurs. Here you have again the idea of something that is extinct. You have something that is fragmentary, something that is in fact very lyrical. Lyrical sometimes a bad word, but this writing is so poetic. It's just incredible. So I'm going to read the last page. It's not too long. Sort of a 3/4 page here. This is the last page of the story. It is so beautiful, and it combines all of these different elements. We have some of these kind of structural scaffolding kind of things. We have humor. We have this incredible use of detail that's all sort of strange and orthogonal and really suggestive. And we have this kind of tying up of this question of like, is she accumulating the pills because she wants to in fact kill herself? And this takes place when she is finishing up a cleaning job at a woman's house. After the windows came the task of looking for the puzzle piece. Inch by inch in the green shag carpet, cracker crumbs, rubber bands from the Chronicle. I was delighted. This was the best job I ever had. She didn't give a hoot if I smoked or not, so I crawled around on the floor and smoked, sliding my ashtray with me. It's so vivid. It's so incredible. I found the piece way across the room from the puzzle table. It was sky with a little bit of maple, which is so beautiful. I mean, any detail, you have this idea of a maple as being fall. It's sort of autumnal. Things are coming to an end. You have the idea of a piece of puzzle missing, which is, very much like he would feel. She would feel like a part of her was missing and that she was an incomplete puzzle. You also have this idea of sky being both sort of, in fact, we just saw the sky over the dump, but the idea of the sky as being both very clear, but also as being empty. It was sky with a little piece of maple. I found it, she cried. I knew it was missing. I found it, I cried. Then I could vacuum, which I did as she finished the puzzle with a sigh. As I was leaving, I asked her when she thought she might need me again. Who knows, she said. Well, anything goes, I said, and we both laughed. Tare, I don't want to die at all, actually. 40 Telegraph. Bus stop outside the laundry. Mill and Addie's is crowded with people waiting for machines, but festive, like waiting for a table. They stand, chatting at the window, drinking green cans of Sprite. Mill and Addie mingle like genial hosts making change. On the TV, the Ohio State Band plays the national anthem, Snow Flurries in Michigan. It is a cold, clear January day. 4 sideburn cyclists turn up at the corner of 29th like a kite string. A Harley idles at the bus stop, and some kids wave at the rasty rider from the bed of a 50 Dodge pickup truck. I finally weep. So good, so amazing. I mean, and in fact, I'm just in my brain now thinking of all of the things that we did not, in fact, just cover. in that story. It is so rich and so complicated, but also so funny and so accessible. I hope that looking at it today has really deepened your appreciation for the way that she structures her work and how organic it is and how moving and how kind of multi-layered. You might only remember that as being, kind of a funny story about cleaning women, when in fact there is this subtext that is so dark and so emotionally resonant. It's just beautiful. And fairly well into the collection on page 320, Lucia Berlin actually says something about humor that is very revealing. This is in a story called Silence, and she says the following. I haven't talked much about this school. I don't mind telling people awful things if I can make them funny. It was never funny. So this is kind of, this tells us enormous amount about a lot of her work. She tells really terrible, kind of harrowing things, but often is leavening them with humor, which, she's very cognizant of. And in fact, if she's telling you, like, this place was never funny, you're really, you're in for some darkness. So early on, at the very beginning of the story, Dr. H.A. Moynihan, this isn't quite like ha-ha humor. I mean, there's some stuff in this book that's like very kind of slapsticky humor, like kind of ridiculous things happening. But often the humor is very subtle. It's not quite like an actual joke. It's just surprising in a way that is totally delightful. And the opening of this story is like that. So this is Dr. H.A. Moynihan. I hated St. Joseph's. Terrified by the nuns, I struck Sister Cecilia one hot Texas day and was expelled. As punishment, I had to work every day of summer vacation in Grandpa's dental office. Which is so funny. I mean, this idea of like her punishment is that she has to spend the summer with her grandfather. So it's unexpected, it's funny. It's also just hilarious on some level that she hated the school and in fact, she was terrified by the nuns. And so what she did, of course, was hit one of them. So you have this boldness and this brashness, but also the economy here. I mean, she's not telling us the whole story of that. She's just like, I was scared of the nuns. I hit one. I got expelled. And then here I am, terribly fated to work in my grandfather's office. And then at the very end of that story, I think I can spoil this for you because honestly, it's so, well, I'm not going to spoil it for you. In fact. But on 16, I can read the ending of it, and in fact, I won't spoil what happens in the story. In bed, Grandpa slept too, his teeth bared in a Bela Lugosi grin. They must have hurt. He did a good job, my mother said. You don't still hate him, do you, Mama? Oh, yes, she said. Yes, I do. So this is both so dark and so awful. It's exactly what Lucia Berlin said. It's awful. This woman hates her father and in fact is telling her daughter all about it. And the daughter's not wanting her to hate her father. And yet there's this flat, just, bold thing about like, oh yeah, I definitely still hate the man. So again, this is the perfect example of leavening something that is in fact actually very dark. On page 73, this is after the death of a young man. On page 73, these are two women talking. Bella Lynn and I hugged and cried for a while. Then she sighed. Well, at least you have his baby. Babies. What? So then, I mean, this is so funny. Like you assume you're like, oh, at least you have a baby. And this is how this woman is saying, in fact, that she has more than one child. In fact, she's pregnant. But this is how she's like announcing this thing. And it is so surprising also to the reader, but it's also funny. I mean, they're crying and then she's saying this kind of absurd thing that struck me as so funny because it is not at all what you would expect. I mean, again, there's this surprise aspect that is just so effective in creating humor that's very subtle, but also very funny. So this is in a story called Fool to Cry, and it's a discussion between two people. Dear Carlotta, however will you pick up the pieces of your life? I don't want any of those old pieces. I just go along, try not to do any damage. Tell me, what do you feel you have accomplished in your life? I couldn't think of a thing. I haven't had a drink in 3 years, I said. That's scarcely an accomplishment. That's like saying, I haven't murdered my mother. Well, of course, there's that too. Which is so, again, it's so funny. I mean, it should read almost like too jokey, that's like, well, I haven't had anything to drink. Oh, right. And I actually also haven't murdered my mother. But again, it's speaking to a darkness and it is so surprising. A lot of times these surprises are coming in dialogue, which is even more exciting for the reader because we, along with, the interlocutor, the person that our protagonist is talking to, there's such a surprising element to it that it is just delightful. Then in a story called Panteón de Dolores, Panteón de Dolores, we have a continuation of this idea of like this terrible mother. So the first line is this. Not heavenly rest or serene valley, Pantheon of Pain is the name of the cemetery at Chapultepec Park. You can't get away from it in Mexico. Death, blood, pain. And then she's talking about the Day of the Dead and these ofrendas where you put out everything that was important to someone who has died, like on an altar. On our mother's ofrenda, my sister's children had put dozens of Ku Klux Klan figures. She hated them for being the children of a Mexican. Her ofrenda had Hershey's bars, Jack Daniels, mystery books, and many, many dollar bills. Sleeping pills and guns and knives, since she was always killing herself. No noose. She said she couldn't get the hang of it. I mean, talk about dark and talk about amazing. And this idea of that she was always killing herself, it's such an amazing thing to put that in like that continual present tense, the idea of like she was always doing it. I mean, you can't always be killing yourself. So, and also this is such an absurd thing because all of the grandchildren know this. This is the younger sister of the protagonist, and she is married to a man who is Mexican and has a bunch of children who are Mexican. She lives in Mexico City. And clearly this Texan mother is some sort of crazy bigot. And it's just so funny to me how acknowledged it all is. And it would have been funny enough just to have that. But then, of course, we have this kind of hokey joke at the end about the noose, and she couldn't get a hang of it. And that's one of those kind of hackney cliche things. But the fact that it's following on all of this really over-the-top stuff just makes it absolutely work. Oh my gosh, I was thinking that the humor thing was going on a little bit too long, but I have to read this last one. This story is called 502. It's on page 356 of my collection. 502 was the clue for one across in this morning's Times. Easy. That's the police code for driving while intoxicated. So I wrote in DWI. Wrong. I guess all those Connecticut commuters knew you were supposed to put in Roman numerals. I had a few moments of panic, as I always do when memories of my drinking days come up. But since I moved to Boulder, I have learned to do deep breathing and meditation, which never failed to calm me. It's so funny. When I reread that this morning in preparation for this, I was like, I wish that my deep breathing and meditation always calmed me. I was a little bit jealous. But we have this huge breadth of information here. It's a story that's toward the end of the collection. And the 502, it's so funny to me that she's thinking about these Connecticut commuters, and that's just like a little tiny tag of two words. And yet it tells us everything about the sort of class of people that she is kind of setting herself against. She's living in Boulder, Colorado at this point. In real life, she had terrible scoliosis, and she had been a smoker forever, and she'd been a really heavy drinker. So a lot of this, had exacerbated all sorts of medical issues. So she was not doing well at this point when she was in Boulder. But you get this sense, too, of inside the humor, this idea of she sees, 502, and instead of the Roman numerals, she's putting in DWI. That's funny. But then you also do have the kind of uneasiness that, would come up when she would think about her drinking days. It's so powerful. Part of the reason that humor works so well again and again and again is because it usually is linked to something that is painful. And it's the combination of those two things that is so good. In both the introduction and the foreword, there's mention of the fact that there's sort of pain and pleasure in a lot of her work, but the pleasure is what sort of surmounts the pain. And I think that's probably right, but I would argue, too, that the pain in some ways is really what lingers. This is a perfect segue into our close. So what we're going to do here today to finish up our talk is to look at some of the ends of her stories. This isn't going to give anything away, in fact, and I'm not going to read all of them, obviously, because there are many, many stories, and I don't want to ruin them all for you. But I think that there's this thing that she does that is so incredible, where they do end in a way that's very satisfying, but they also lead you off in other directions that are unexpected and so beautiful. And in that other direction, the way that you as the reader are meant to sort of think, are sort of encouraged to think in a different way, it's always reinforcing the point that she is making in the story. The endings of the stories are unexpected and unusual and just so, so good. We're just going to look at 3 of these pretty quickly. So this is the ending of a story that's actually very harrowing and also very funny, of course, about some of her most serious and very difficult moments with alcohol. So at the end on page 60, the last little paragraph is this. And as I'm reading, note the economy, the way that she's really not afraid to use this kind of staccato, single words, this fragments together with these beautiful sentences. Flour, milk, Ajax. She only had wine vinegar at home, which, with ant abuse, could throw her into convulsions. She wrote cider vinegar on the list. So beautiful. I mean, it really speaks to just the difficulties and the fact that she is now taking antabuse to help her get over her alcoholism. But also, there's a certain measure of hope here. The idea that she's going, when she goes to the store to buy the milk, she has young children at this time. I mean, it's just a harrowing story. And the young children are sort of involved, and really understand how difficult life is for her and are trying to help her, as a single mom. So this idea of putting cider vinegar on the list, that she's really trying. And because it's in this domestic frame, it's like this shopping list that she is making. And, flour, milk, Ajax, these are things that they're very sort of nutrient-rich kind of things. Like it's milk for her young boys, and it's flour to bake bread, and it's Ajax to clean the house. They're sort of these very basic things. And then with them is this idea that, like, she could have convulsions if she has wine vinegar, and in fact, she is going to get cider. Only 8 pages away on 68, we have the end of another beautiful story. And this is when we have the narrator here, her name is Lou. So again, this is when we are sort of invited to think of Lucia Berlin as, in fact, conflating herself with the narrator. And she is in a park in Oakland, in Merritt Park, actually, which is a park I know. And she's with her father, who's in a wheelchair. He loosened his brakes, and the chair started down the brick path. I hesitated, just stood there watching it. But then I threw away my cigarette and caught his chair just as it was picking up speed. Unbelievable. So sweet. Really also leaning into the ambivalence that you would have having been raised by these people. And some of the endings are just incredibly sad and poignant. I'm just going to read the very last lines of this one. There was nobody to speak to say I was sorry. I mean, you just end on this kind of desolate note, which is to say that not all of this, not all of Lucia Berlin is leavened by this kind of, humor, but it is always, the endings of the stories are always just incredibly well done. So I could go on hours and hours and hours about these stories and about her incredible prose and just the richness and the complexity, and also the fact that so much is happening in them. But I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that this discussion has either convinced you to read the collection or that you have really deepened your appreciation. She is just so good. And I was so happy to see her on that list because I really, truly do believe that this collection is one of the top 100 books, absolutely, of the 21st century. Thanks so much for listening. Happy reading.